Welcome to the latest episode of WSP's Anticipate podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Gribbin, the ESG Advisory Service Lead for WSP in the Middle East. COP26 has been and gone, and for the first time in 2 years, countries have come together to discuss the global climate agenda and agree on actions that can take us forward into the next decade. It saw many significant public and private agreements come to light, and today I look forward to unpacking those with the head of WSP's Global Innovation and Sustainability Program, Future Ready, David Symons. David and many WSP colleagues attended COP over the past several weeks, and we look forward to understanding his insights. David, thank you for joining us today on the Anticipate podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on board, and thank you for your time.
Oh, hi, Daniel. Yeah, pleasure to be with you.
Excellent. Now, recently there was a small conference that happened up in Glasgow there, and WSP was quite heavily involved, but it was the Conference of Parties, or COP26, which was held in the UK this year. Maybe just for the people who are listening to this who haven't really been familiar with COP at all, could you give a brief summary of the little bit of its history and the significance of the conference?
For sure. So very simply, the COP, as is referred to in this case, is around climate change. There's a number of UN-related COPs, and these meetings are gatherings of the vast majority of countries across the world that come together to agree, collaborate, make commitments on how globally the world will come together to, in this case, reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to, at best, establish and find a way to keep climate change as close as possible to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the first conference in a couple of years after the pandemic as well to be held in person, which was quite a significant step there in Glasgow. And I suppose WSP was quite heavily involved. I know you and yourself were involved in several of the events, but what is your assessment and sort of the major outcomes of what was discussed through the Glasgow 2-week period, and what can we learn from it?
A number of questions that we can break down there. Yes. So this was the first time people had come together for COP in Glasgow. This conference was meant to be held last year, so a little bit like the Olympics. This was almost the 2020 COP, but that's been good because that's just meant that people have been able to focus and leaders have been able to focus a little bit more on climate action rather than really sort of getting stuck into the pandemic, which of course has been such a priority last year. And WSP has been there. So yeah, we had a number of people who were present at the conference, but also, you know what, you didn't have to be in Glasgow to be taking climate action. There was lots of programs and initiatives that WSP teams have been involved with across the world, and also within our countries as well. There was large numbers of regions and municipalities that also organised events as well in terms of bringing the local action as well as the national. Now, in terms of then what came out of COP, there was probably two things. First of all, there was the formal agreements, and then secondly, there's the informal agreements. So from a formal perspective, the main thing, the challenge for this COP was that countries were requested being a nice way to really saying you must come back with a beefed up plan of what will you do as a country to cut your greenhouse gas emissions at a pace that limits climate change. And so that was really, countries did that before COP in the vast majority of cases. So UAE, for example, made a commitment that it would be net zero by 2050 in its NDC. Saudi made a commitment, maybe slightly challenged, that it will be net zero by 2060, with implementation plans to say things like half of electricity from renewables by 2030. Big, bold commitments there. What came out of COP is that that's all tremendous, but then there was a bunch of other things that were formally agreed, which were especially around a request, again, that for the next COP, countries were asked to come back and beef up their targets. There was also some commitments around phasing out inefficient fuel subsidies. There was some work on what's known formally as the Paris Rulebook. And then there was also some side agreements as well. So some of those that were especially key methane, 100 countries, including the UAE, including Saudi, came together to say that they would reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030 compared to 2020 levels. And I suppose the other one that's eye-catching is especially one called technology breakthroughs, where 40 nations, including UAE, said that they would work together to align standards, coordinate investments to speed up and bring forward what you might call the tipping point for green technologies.
Yeah, amazing. And they were some absolutely significant milestones that were reached there. I suppose one of the things we did talk about last time we caught up with you were countries we were hoping would be very bold, very aspirational. We saw a few big omissions, omissions, that is, not emissions, from people signing up to some of these pledges, particularly in the likes of Russia and China. How do you think that impacted the overall pledges and success of the conference itself?
There was a lot of coverage at the end of the conference around the disappointment when, for example, India and China succeeded in watering down a particular piece of the text around phasing out coal when the final wording at the 11th hour was changed to phasing down. I think we can always be challenging around that. The reality is that this was the first time that a global climate deal has explicitly set out that fossil fuel consumption is a major driver of climate change and set out a plan to reduce the use of coal to generate electricity. I think overall, from a WSP perspective, we will acknowledge those weaknesses, but also think in the round that COP26 was a success and was as good as we could have expected.
Absolutely. And it probably leads me on to a second question I have there around the impact on the developing world, because we all recognize that, and I think it was one of the big outcomes, is that the developed world needs to help fund some of the past impacts of climate change. So what was your take on how this will play out for the developing world, and what more can the developed world do or was agreed to through the conference?
I think that the simple answer is that the developed world has to provide more cash. And there is a discussion to be had on compensation for developing countries for climate change caused fundamentally by developed countries. I think on cash, developed countries promised in 2009 to provide £100 billion in public and private funding each year from 2020. We've not got there yet. Over COP, there was a beef up in this, but generally, it's not thought that 100 billion target would be achieved until next year, which is a miss. I think then there is a longer conversation to be had around compensation, this concept called loss and damage. Developing countries put forward a proposal for a new damages fund to assist nations that suffer losses from things like hurricanes or rising sea levels, and that compensation should be paid by developed countries. That was strongly resisted by the US especially. I think we will see that there is going to be more conversation on that next year when COP is chaired by a developing country, given that that's going to be held in Egypt. We will see more of that next year, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's very important that it's being held in the MENA region and the impact that climate change has on Africa, for example, as well as the developing nation. And one of the things I wanted to touch on is the significance of the reduction in the methane emissions. So it was a 30% reduction in methane emissions by 2030 that 100 countries signed up to, as you said. Perhaps you could unpack that a little bit for us and what you think that will play out like over the coming 8 or 9 years.
Well, first of all, just a tiny bit of science. Methane is the second biggest cause of climate change after carbon dioxide. It mainly comes from agriculture, energy, gas leaks in transmission, and from waste. The thing about methane is it doesn't hang around in the atmosphere very long. It has a much shorter life in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide, but it's a much more potent greenhouse gas. if we can take action right now on reducing the amount of methane from cattle, for example, on really drilling down on leaks of methane from gas pipelines, for example, we can have a fast impact on climate change because it doesn't hang around in the atmosphere, as I've said. So if we can deliver that commitment to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030 against 2020 levels, if that's fully implemented, scientists say that that can limit global warming by about 0.2 degrees by 2050, which is some big deal.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the other one that I'd like your take on, or to talk about the significant, was the Glasgow Declaration on Deforestation, which I suppose a lot of our listeners probably associate climate change with deforestation and trees and such. So it was quite a significant pledge that around 110 countries made. So, and I know it's one particularly in Saudi Arabia where they've just announced a 10 billion tree policy that they will be implementing. But perhaps you could unpack that for a little bit for the listeners around what the significance of that is and what we expect to see there.
Yeah, and congratulations to Saudi Arabia for making that announcement as well. It's big and bold and it's exciting. The Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use, as you say, signed by countries covering about 91% of the world's forests. And that does include big forest countries, Canada, Brazil, Russia, China, Indonesia, etc., etc. So it is welcome. If your glass half full, it's welcome. If your glass half empty on this, there are some weaknesses in it. First of all, the weakness is that there is no interim target, so it was seen as potentially quite a soft thing that countries could sign up. And already there are some cracks showing in the declaration. Indonesia, for example, is disputing the definition of deforestation. Brazil has committed to end what it calls illegal deforestation, but much of the tree loss in Brazil at the moment is classed as legal.
Absolutely. Okay. And interesting to take on that and to see how that develops through those parts of, it's the developing world again, which has a major role to play. So I suppose one of the big questions I have is net zero, is 1.5 degrees still alive? Has this conference given us a concrete answer one way or the other, or are we sort of holding our hands out waiting for the next one?
I think you have to say, Daniel, that 1.5 degrees is still alive, but my goodness, there's still work to do on this. Glasgow, I think we regard it as a success, but there is still so much work to be done on this. Even the next 12 months ahead of COP27 will be critical, and on to COP28 the year after that.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's your expectation if we were to do a 12-month looking glass into COP27 to be held in Egypt? Any early assessments of what you would hope to see there?
I think the thing that we really need is countries to come back ahead of COP27 in Egypt with beefed up national determined contributions. Yeah, I mean, there is still a mighty amount of work to be done on that, and we stay hopeful. Again, if I'm being glass half full, that's tremendous. If I'm being glass half empty, the key paragraph requesting stronger targets was weakened in the closing stages of the conference. There was some subtle words added in that said taking into account different national circumstances. And again, some of the skeptics are saying that India and China especially could come back to say, hey, you know what? We need cheap coal power to develop our economies. We are already doing as much as we possibly can do. There's a lot of climate diplomacy to be done over the next 12 months.
I suppose just one last lens is COP is mainly focused around a governmental and a national agenda, but how did you see the impacts for private companies and investors out of COP? What should they read into it? I know there was a new net zero standard announced just previous to COP as well. So how would they be thinking about the outcomes of COP?
Well, I think there's two things on this, Daniel. I mean, first of all, you're right that we now do have a definition of if a company wants to say we will be a net zero company, there is now a rule book for what does that actually mean in practice. And probably the bit that is most clear on that is that you can only use offsets for 10% of your residual emissions. You can't just offset everything and say we're net zero. I think the other thing is that, especially at this COP, this was one of the first COPs where what's called the real economy, and that means business, was really in the room. And so there was a number of commitments let's say, the commitment on cars and electrification of fleet, where the commitment was made both by governments saying that they would phase out fossil fuel cars on a timescale. That was made by a number of countries. It was also made by a number of private auto companies themselves, Ford, GM, Mercedes, JLR, and China's BYD, for example. So increasingly, I think we will see government and private commerce coming together to make these commitments.
Absolutely. It's very powerful. I think we need everyone at the table at the same time to ensure that we get that collective thinking and we all rowed the boat in the same direction. One of the other ones I saw as well was the establishment of a International Sustainability Standards Board as well, to be released by the IFRS. Do you think that will have a major impact? I know there are many standards out there already for reporting on sustainability, such as SASB and GRI. Did you see that as a major announcement also?
I think beefed up standards are always helpful so long as they don't get in the way of action. I think what's also worth noting is that we saw at COP that governments are also beginning to require additional reporting for companies within their jurisdictions as well. So just within the UK, for example, there's a new requirement now that large companies, both traded companies and also private companies, will have to be reporting their climate risks publicly against an international standard called TCFD, and also that all listed companies and asset funds will have to be producing a mandatory climate transition plan so investors can make a decision themselves on how much climate risk do they want to be taking on for their pensions and their investments.
I certainly agree. There's sometimes the red tape can get in the way, but we definitely need to be all aligned in there. And then I suppose just on a final thought from you, David, I mean, the wrap up of COP, it's now been a few weeks since the conference. How do you think our clients and our stakeholders will receive this? And if you have any sort of recommendations for them, what would they be going forward as they start to plan for 2022?
I think my main recommendation for this, Dan, which many of our clients are already hard at work on, is just understand both the risk and also the opportunity that climate change and the net zero agenda provides. You can look at climate change as an operational issue. The benefit that most of our leading companies that we're working with, and you'll know from WSP as well, is that climate action is also a very, very substantial top line growth opportunity, as much as one around reporting and verification.
Thank you, David, and thank you for joining us today and for participating in COP and providing your insights to all our listeners of Anticipate.
It's a pleasure as always, Dan.
Thank you again for joining us, David. You've provided a great overview of the outcomes of COP26 and what to look forward to at COP27 and beyond. And to our listeners, if you enjoyed today's episode on COP26, please hit the subscribe button via our SoundCloud channel to stay up to date with more insights from industry experts and WSP thought leaders.